This is the Gymnog Pod with your host, Jim Noguera. On today's show, episode 8, Sam Kimball, freelance journalist. Let's start the show.
This is the Gymnog Pod with Jim Noguera. It is the Gymnog Pod with Jim Noguera.
Most interested man
It is the
world.
Gymnog
Interested,
Pod with Jim Noguera.
a most interested man
Jim
in the
Noguera.
world. Interested,
It is the
interested.
in the world.
Welcome to today's episode. I know Sam Kimball like I know many guests so far on the podcast from the Writing Center at Bronx Community College. We set up this conversation over FaceTime, and Iraq is about 7 hours ahead of where I am in New York. This podcast centers on basically what he does and what independent journalism and freelance journalism are, and the ups and downs of those occupations in somewhere like the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It was very insightful and honestly a lot of fun, and I'm glad I got to catch up with Sam. I look forward to doing more Skype and FaceTime podcasts. I was happy that we were able to do this. And again, I can't stress enough how important I think his work is to take some measurable risk and put himself out there to investigate and be kind of a one of my favorite definitions of a journalist, which is a detective for the people, and a much needed one given the region and the circumstances and the context in Iraq. Hopefully he'll come back on in the future and we'll have some more interesting things to talk about. And now, Sam Kimball. How are you, my friend?
I'm pretty good. I'm really tired. I need to make dinner, but I'm lazy because my roommate's on a Skype call, so we can't cook together. So anyway, we'll cook after this. Yeah.
So it's I'm sorry. It's what, 10 there? 10 o'clock?
Yeah, just about. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
And were you were teaching a class today?
Yeah, I was teaching earlier today. I taught 2 classes. I haven't had a lot of sleep, and I'm on a cold brew coffee, basically.
Oh, geez Louise.
But I'm really happy that you decided to do this, and I get to help and spread like your story, because I think it's really interesting, and I think what you're doing is out of the ordinary. I mean, you've always, stricken me as a humble dude who, but I think what you're doing is I don't think a lot of people would do it personally, because it's for obvious reasons. I would love to share some of this with my class, because I'm teaching a class called it's an English composition class, right? But it has a theme, and the theme is propaganda and journalism.
Mm.
And I would love for you to talk about what you do, what motivated you to do what you do, which includes journalism, but it also includes going to Iraq and going to North Africa. Yeah, tell me about that.
So about the motivations.
Yeah, start there.
Okay. So yeah, I yeah. If I think back to, I was 20 years old. Boy, that was a third of my life ago. That was in 2007, and at that time, I thought I wanted to be like a farmer poet, um, or a like kind of academic scholar of like Islamic studies or something, because I had just started studying Arabic and at City College of New York, and then my dad just kind of like off the cuff mentioned like, why don't you be a journalist? And that all of a sudden that seemed like a really good idea, because it seemed like a good combination of politics and exploring different cultures and traveling to faraway places and writing and kind of teaching or informing people. So those were all things that I was passionate about. And so yeah, and then ever since he suggested that, that was like, that became like my like mission. But it took like like 4.5 years before I ever like got started on it. But yeah, it was like always clear in my mind during that time. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be a journalist. I just didn't know quite how to start. Um, and and then yeah, I had been studying Arabic in Syria in 2010, prior to the outbreak of the Syrian Revolution and what later became the Civil War. Um, um, and so that's when I became sort of more or less fluent in Arabic. And yeah, and then I came back to the U.S., and the Arab Spring was kind of exploding across a number of countries like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, and Bahrain, and Yemen. And then I went back to Syria to continue my studies for another couple of months. Um, and the protests started like a week after I got there, and I felt like, oh man, like this is it. Like now I should start covering things. But I literally I just was kind of frozen, and I didn't know what to do, how to start, and what to cover, and how to do it without getting like shot or arrested. And so yeah, so really I didn't do anything there, and it wasn't until I went back to the United States, and met this journalist who I had kind of been following for a while, named Anand Gopal, who's like prolific writer, and he's got an excellent book out about Afghanistan, and he works a lot on Iraq and Syria now. And I was just like, hey, I want to be a journalist in the Middle East, and I don't know what to do. And he said, you should not go to graduate school as is your plan. You should stop that, and you should not even start, and you should go back to the Middle East. Like, why are you here? But instead I said, okay, well, I don't know where I would go or what I would do exactly. So I started my graduate school program in New York, and then while during that first semester, I started connecting with a few people. I met a few like Yemeni American activists and journalists who had been in Yemen, which seemed to me to be one of the least covered aspects of the Arab Spring, perhaps aside from like Bahrain. Um, yeah, I met them, and then um, and they really encouraged me. And so then I kind of said, okay, I'm going to go to Yemen. That's where I'm going to be a journalist. And so it took several months, lots of kind of, reaching out and talking to people and finding out how I could get there. Because at the time it was in a state of kind of almost civil war. And, and, and then I took a leave of absence from my graduate school program, and then in February of 2012, I finally got a visa and a plane ticket, and I found a way in, and I went, and that's where I just kind of like landed and met a few other journalists, and then kind of like imitated them, and that's how I got started as a freelance journalist.
Why Iraq?
Well, I guess I should just walk it back a little bit, because I realized I didn't fully respond to what you said about motivations.
Okay.
And I will keep it brief. But just for me, like when the idea of being a journalist first came to my mind, I remember it clearly in the summer of 2007. For me, it was like kind of a cool way to, just like write and meet different people from different cultures and like learn different languages and travel around. But the motivations then kind of grew beyond that as well, because in the intervening years between sort of when I got that idea and when I actually began to practice, or practice professionally, I sort of became a lot more politically active and politically conscious, and I started feeling that I wanted to do more than just write about kind of interesting artistic or cultural events, but that I wanted to explain sort of political events or social movements to people, and in some small way lend a voice to people who were or are oppressed or were fighting for some kind of political reform or revolution, and perhaps for their own freedom. So then in those intervening years, 2009, 10, 11, my ideas about why I would want to be a journalist became a little bit more than just kind of like this would be like a fun novelty, or like just be kind of like play for work, but rather that like, okay, I want to sort of catalog and journal and recount whatever I can about issues concerning ordinary people, struggling for their rights or their freedoms, and the complications that arise during those struggles. And then it just so happened that then the Arab Spring broke out and gave me and probably a whole generation of young wannabe journalists like a very good excuse to go and just do just that, because it was a very clear, mass expression of people's dissatisfaction with their political and economic systems and their desire for something radically different, and they were willing to fight for it. So I mean, me and many others, I can name a lot of them I've met, and some of them, and many more that I've heard of, were then like, oh, okay, well, this is something that I agree with, or that I support, and that I'd love to be in the midst of and to give some voice to through media. So anyway, that's kind of a long thing about the motivations there, in a more general sense. And it just so happened, obviously, that at that time I had already spent some time in a few different Arab countries, and and by that point spoke and read and wrote Arabic pretty relatively fluently. So that was like a huge practical boost for me. Um, uh, yeah, and then as for Iraq specifically, I suppose that actually does then go back to Anand Gopal, who I mentioned before. I had been living abroad doing some thesis research and journalism in North Africa, specifically Tunisia, and I was in Egypt as well, and a few years ago. And then when I came back, I met Anand and asked him what he was working on, and by that point, he had started writing about and reporting on Iraq, which I sort of had no real interest in or like familiarity with. But I just was desperate to get involved in some kind of journalistic work that mattered again, because I had moved back to New York. And so I started kind of helping him on the side here and there, conducting a little research and doing some translation work for him because I spoke Arabic. Yeah, and that gave me a bit of a little bit of knowledge of what was happening in Iraq. This is after the takeover by the Islamic State of like large chunks of the country in 2014. And I began to get just a little bit kind of more invested in it, sort of intellectually and emotionally. Through hearing about some of the stories that Anand was investigating, realizing the profound, the extreme difficulties that so many ordinary Iraqis found themselves in, kind of crushed between a rock and a hard place. Not able to trust their government, which was corrupt and abusive. And all its affiliated militias and armed groups, and abused or attacked or harassed by ISIS in some cases, and kind of not being able to go forward or backward or left or right, just trapped between so many horrible options. So we worked together. We attempted to go to Iraq to get a grant in 2016 to get a grant to go to Iraq and report about an uprising, a popular uprising against ISIS that was happening in a particular city. That didn't quite work out, but I kept. He went. I wasn't able to go, but I kept kind of pursuing the idea. And then in the later months of 2016, I decided, okay, it's time for me to get back out there. And Iraq, seeing as how that's something I've been kind of reading about a bit and researching a bit, that'll be the place that I go. In addition to the fact that I now knew about some of these tremendous stories that Anand had uncovered, and other journalists as well, that just showed ordinary people trying to get by in really extraordinary circumstances of difficulty and violence and pressure. And also being an American and living in the United States, seeing Americans left and right, particularly, as the presidential campaign heated up and with the rhetoric of people like Donald Trump, but many others as well, that was just so violently Islamophobic, anti-Arab, so hawkish in terms of wanting to increase American military intervention in the Middle East and places like Syria and Iraq, under the guise of destroying ISIS, but really also destroying many people's lives. And so I could see that Iraq, among other places, was a place that was just tremendously misunderstood by Americans. Iraqi people were tremendously misunderstood by many Americans who feared them or hated them because of America's involvement in the war for so many years, and because of the recent eruption of ISIS there. And so I wanted to go and just try and correct people's understanding of the struggles that ordinary Iraqis go through and the choices they face through journalism. So those were my sort of general kind of like ideological motivations. I'm not sure if I've quite like achieved those goals, but it's something I'm working on while also trying to make a living and expand my skill set.
I recently read the article that you shared on social media. Forgive me, I don't remember the exact title, but it was about journalism in the Kurdistan region. And you were talking about how hostile of an environment it is for independent journalists there. So I want to make this maybe a two-part question. One, what is the state of independent journalism in Iraq, and how do you keep safe? And lastly, is it something that you would? I mean, obviously you do it, but is it something that you would recommend for most journalists to do, to, if they feel passionate about it? I mean, obviously there are some safety concerns, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. I mean, it's a different culture, a different language, and as you say, it can be hostile towards journalists. So if you can address those.
Well, let's see. Yeah, to me it seems like the question or the subject of independent journalism needs to be broken down into different parts. There is like what I wrote about in that particular article that you referred to, that I think came out in late July with El Monitor, which is an American-based news outlet that focuses on the Middle East. That was about, as you said, that was about the challenges, sometimes lethal, faced by independent or kind of critical journalists in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is a sort of semi-independent part of northern Iraq. It's actually where I'm speaking to you from right now and where I've been living. It's inhabited largely by Kurdish people who have had struggles since for a long time, but for long stretches of the 20th century, we're in kind of armed conflict with the state of Iraq, trying to get greater independence, greater freedom, and a state of their own, because they're their own people with their own language and their own traditions and customs and history, but had no state of their own. And instead, we're living, kind of between Iraq and Syria and Iran and Turkey. So anyway, yeah. And in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, as I said, which is like semi-autonomous, it has its own local government. It's much safer on a security level than the rest of Iraq. It's much more stable, but it certainly has its own problems: economic, military, in terms of freedom of expression and human rights. And so that's what I was talking about in that article, was how Kurdish journalists here, who don't kind of toe the party line, who conduct deep investigations into allegations of corruption or violence committed by members of one of the two ruling parties inside Iraqi Kurdistan, can get them harassed, arrested, beaten, and in more cases than there should be, sometimes killed, and for reporting critically on on certain military or political figures here. So those kind of journalists, like one of them in that article is just this like really nice, very well educated Kurdish guy who is like an English teacher and a freelance translator. I mean, he speaks very, very, very good English, but then also does some journalistic investigations here and there, and is a bit of a social media advocate for sort of human rights and transparency, anti-corruption issues in Kurdistan. And one of the women there now works, I think, with a local radio station, and has worked with a series of TV channels and radio stations before that. I don't know if she's ever been a freelancer in the way that I am, but she's independent in the sense that she works for it. To my understanding, works for local news outlets that are not owned or controlled by these major political figures, and so they don't have they have a certain ability to report critically on those people, on the local parties here, on issues of corruption or political prisoners or political assassinations. And one of the other characters there is kind of a freelance journalist, and now I think he works for like a family business just because it's so hard to make a living as an independent journalist here. And and he's had his share of he's been sent to court like 14 times by local authorities over kind of minor infractions in order to kind of wear down his morale and drain him of funds. And he's had he's faced a number of kind of a variety of harassment because of some of the work that he has done in the past, investigating corruption and cronyism and assassinations. So those are local Iraqi Kurdish journalists, and those are some of the struggles that they face that are not only economic but also can in some cases cost them their lives. What I know a little bit less about is just the state of independent journalists in Iraq more broadly, whether they're Arab or Kurdish or otherwise. My sense is that, as it often is in the Middle East, from what I've seen, it's really hard for them to make a living if they make one at all, because the outlets, the local Iraqi outlets, or perhaps regional outlets that they would sell to, just don't pay them very much, or they don't pay them at all. And they themselves, wherever they might be in Iraq, if they investigate too deeply into some, allegations of, criminal conduct of some militia leader or government figure, or like well-connected business person or family, they too could face harassment or violence, and in some cases, killing. So I don't have all the details on that, unfortunately, but it does seem to me just like such a struggle. Not to mention the fact that a lot of their work probably, if they're writing in Arabic or if they're writing in Kurdish, probably only gets kind of circulated through Iraq, or maybe a few of the neighboring countries, but it doesn't get quite as much exposure as even the most minor foreign freelance journalist would get from their country. So it's quite unequal in that way. and me simply just as an American with an American passport, sure, there are certain red lines about things that authorities or political figures or influential people in the country might not want me to report about, and there can be repercussions. I could be harassed. I could be arrested. I could be deported. But those things are much less likely to happen to me because I'm an American, because I have an American passport and a connection to my government, which supports this government with money and weapons. So it's really an uneven thing. It's like I come to this country and I report from here. My work, which can in some cases be much less nuanced and well informed than that of a local journalist, will get kind of echoed around the world more than their work will in most cases. And the risks that I face in terms of like harassment or punishment are less simply just because of my nationality and the passport that I carry. And I'll probably, even though it's terribly hard to get paid, very much at all as a freelance journalist, and to make ends meet, I'll probably get paid a lot more than they would for any given article or report or broadcast.
Yeah, so I mean, I was gonna ask, or yeah, if you would encourage people, journalists, to basically do what you're doing, to go to Iraq and do independent journalism from there. But I mean, you've kind of outlined, the pros and cons. I don't know if you want to add anything to what you said.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that last part of the question. And I do think that, I mean, I would say that Iraq is one of a handful of places. Well, I shouldn't say that. I focus, all my journalistic work is focused on, the Middle East and North Africa, basically Arabic-speaking countries, pretty much for the last 5 years. So. But within this region, I would say Iraq is a terribly important country, particularly for journalists from the United States, or who have great access to an American audience, right? Because I think that there's a lot that needs to be cleared up, and a lot that needs to be spoken about. For a country where the United States is intervening militarily pretty heavily, and has been since 2014, after already having been at war or occupying this country in one way or another between 2003 and 2011. And I think because of that war and occupation, and the soldiers that were killed or who had life-threatening experiences or lost loved ones in this country, there's just a lot of and because of all the political wrangling during those 8 years, there's just a terrible amount of I think most Americans just think probably a lot of Americans, if they know anything about Iraq at all, they would just mix it up with, in their minds, it would simply stand for kind of instability, violent jihadist radicalism, and civil conflict. And there is that, but I think that needs to be explained, and that needs to be explained how that happened. And in my understanding, a huge portion of that has been kind of sparked or set off or set into motion by the American invasion in 2003 and the subsequent occupation. And so, yeah, I would say I would encourage American journalists who have some kind of freedom or independence and are allowed to choose where they cover or what countries they cover to come to Iraq and cover Iraq, and particularly now that the battle to liberate the city of Mosul from ISIS has concluded. You can already see a lot of the journalists, whether they're staffers or freelancers, leaving the country because the kind of big news headlines are over. But the problems and the conflicts and the instability and the suffering of ordinary people continues in a huge way throughout the country. And so I would say that now is a particularly important time for journalists to come here, stay, see what's happening, make connections, and explain in a critical yet compassionate way who exactly is at fault here in Iraq, what has caused these conflicts, what's perpetuating them, and how ordinary people are dealing with these situations. So it's not an easy place. It's not always pleasant. It's not cheap, actually, because to live in a place that's so unstable, where you have to pay for security and drivers and this and that, it's not the cheapest place that I've lived or worked in. That's for sure. But I do think that the stories here told by ordinary people and the understanding that one can give to an American audience in particular by reporting from here and why the conflicts are happening here and why people are suffering is incredibly important, especially now. So yeah, just to reiterate, I would say now is the time, and I think as many independent reporters as possible should come to Iraq.
How much time do we have?
Maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier wanting to break down independent journalism, and I think that would be really helpful for the students in my propaganda journalism class. So yeah, talk about it, break it down, and I think they would benefit from it.
Yeah, the term independent journalism, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I'm not sure anyone does. I think the meaning is sort of fluid. When I introduce myself to most Iraqi people, and I'm speaking Arabic, I call myself an independent journalist because I'm not sure exactly how to say freelance journalist, and I'm not sure if they're the same thing or not. I mean, they certainly overlap. To me, an independent journalist, I suppose you could say, is someone who is not a full-time employee at a particular news organization, and is therefore free to publish or sell stories or spread their stories or reports among a variety of news or media outlets. But beyond that, to me, it also means someone. I mean, then it also gets into the area of your attitude and outlook politically. I think an independent journalist is someone whose goal is not to flatter or to praise or to dwell excessively on the doings, perhaps the good doings of a particular political leader or party or group, and to be sort of adversarial and critical and dig deep, particularly in areas of wrongdoing for all parties, and particularly though for those parties that wield power, for those parties that have or those groups that have the ability to oppress other people. So to me, yeah, that's the extended definition of an independent journalist is someone who doesn't have is not beholden to a loyalty to a certain group or gang or political party, doesn't have a loyalty or affiliation, and is ready to combat one as much as they are the other. Yeah, that's my sort of personal view of what that means. I believe in that idea of sort of adversarial and critical journalism, and shining a light on the misconduct or the wrongdoings of those in power, or those with influence or resources, and whenever possible, trying to give some kind of voice or expression to people who don't have that power or those resources or that influence. Yeah, and then freelance journalism, which I guess is kind of a part of independent journalism, is just means that you're not on staff at a particular news outlet or agency. You're not like a full-time employee with them. So I send a pitch to Al Jazeera, and I send a pitch to the Daily Beast, and and whoever takes it or kind of agrees to pay me a certain fee, then I go with them. But so that gives you a certain amount of freedom. You can kind of, to a degree, you can pick who you will write for, who you will do your radio broadcasts or your video pieces for. But you also it's also like very unstable, right? And you're not. I mean, you get no like benefits. It's not like if you were a full-time staff reporter or journalist where you would get probably insurance and some kind of regular salary and benefits. You don't have that, and so you're just trying to scrape together a living from this check, that check, this payment, that payment, for individual stories or individual projects that you've been part of. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to make work financially, and it's hard to get your start and to kind of gain a reputation and a following and a certain level of respect, I suppose, as a freelance journalist. But that ability to be independent, as we said, and to look at or be critical about whoever might be in the wrong, whoever might need a voice. That's something I think you have more of as a freelance journalist, and it does also give a certain amount of freedom in being able to develop creatively and professionally. I think if you were perhaps a staff writer for the Associated Press, it would be really difficult or impossible for you to say, hey, you know what? I want to team up with a filmmaker and create like this documentary film about some particular subject in Iraq. Like, you couldn't do that if you went to an office most days out of the week and you had a regular job at a news agency, because you would have an exclusivity contract. So you would not be allowed to work with other outlets or other media producers. So in that way, it gives you a certain amount of freedom in who you work with and what kind of projects you do, and maybe you could pair up with a photographer or a filmmaker or a radio journalist, or become one yourself, and that's something that it would be much harder to do spontaneously as a staff journalist or someone with a full-time contract, where your responsibilities are much more sort of delineated and defined.
Right. Are there ever any downsides to freelance besides the obvious economic ones that you mentioned? Like, I mean, I don't know, right? Because I don't really do that work, but do you ever find yourself, maybe because of the market or maybe because of your needs, having to write particular articles with a particular bent to them, trying to appeal to a certain market? Um, I only say this because I'm trying to look at like the other side. If there are any cons to that approach.
Oh, I think that's a really fair question. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, aside from the obvious economic difficulties that you get, you go through, you go out, you report a piece, you write it, a story, you write it, um, and then you go through rounds of edits, and it might take a month or a couple months. I mean, in my case, at least, I work slower than some others uh, until you finally get the thing published, and then it might take another month to get paid. So you're kind of like waiting on all these checks to come in, and we're just talking about like a few $100s here, a few $100s there. It's not like you're waiting for like a $10,000 check usually, unless you happen to be producing huge video documentaries or something, in which case you might be paid a lot more. So for your kind of ordinary freelance print journalist or writer, as I am, yeah. So aside from those, certainly, yeah. I mean, if um, there have been certain outlets that I've written for who like they kind of, because I want to be able to report something, learn about something, research something, a particular subject, and then learn who had a role and who did what and who was in the wrong and who was in the right. Um, I do think there is wrong and right, and so for certain publications I know that I've written for before, that are often ones that are devoted to humanitarian causes or with particular like humanitarian organizations. They very often, because of the nature of their work and because they're trying to be apolitical and not take sides and simply just get the word out about people suffering, or kind of raise money or resources for people suffering or in terrible circumstances, then there they often take out the kind of like the teeth of the reporting, and you don't really get to name names or kind of point the finger in your work, and instead it has to be kind of just boiled down to, here's a problem, here's why it's happening, here's how it's affecting people in this negative way, and maybe here's a possible way to help them. But never kind of pointing out who might be to blame or who might be causing the problem. So that's kind of that's sometimes a downside to working with outlets that are specifically humanitarian oriented, just because they take out sometimes the critical nature of the reporting. And beyond that, definitely, like I've run into news outlets. I remember one time I pitched a news outlet, like a mainstream news outlet, that something about American and the coalition, the alliance that they're in, these warplanes dropping bombs on Mosul and just like killing entire families in an attempt to kill ISIS fighters, but entire families of civilians. And then I remember someone, like an editor, wrote back to me and said, "Yeah, okay, great. Well, it should look maybe kind of like this piece," and send me a link to another piece, which was like about how like America makes mistakes in its wars in the Middle East, but Russia is like really, really bad. And that was not at all the point of like my article or the research that I had done or the stories that I had heard. So I kind of turned that down just because it seemed like this editor who was like thousands of miles away was trying to put his own spin on this story that it didn't seem like he knew very much about. So in that case, like I declined that piece. And aside from that, yeah, there are some freelancers who really get on a roll and they have a great reputation, and they're really fast workers and they're good at networking. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, and just as a freelancer, sometimes it's just hard to get work. Editors are overloaded, or they just don't have the resources, and it's hard to get a response often to your pitches. I've spent sometimes days working on a particular pitch, which is like a proposal for a story or a report. And I think I've got something really gold, something really beautiful. And I'll send it out to all these outlets that I think would be interested. And it's not even like they turn it down; they just don't respond at all. And I'd say that's probably the majority of the cases that I have. It's like usually not a response. So you really have to spread your stuff out, trying to at least get some interest from a publication, and then who knows? Maybe this might be your third or fourth or fifth choice publication, one that you don't think is so hot, or one that's simply not going to pay you that much. So yeah, that's another obstacle. Simply just trying to get the attention of these publications. Sometimes it's easier if you've worked with them a lot before. They know your name and they know, okay, this so-and-so who's emailing me, I'll actually look at his pitch, I'll actually respond to it. But, it would be a lot easier if you were actually a staff member with the publication. Then, of course they're not going to ignore you. So does that make sense at all? Like those are some other obstacles and cons.
Yeah, it definitely does make sense. When you were talking about the rejections and stuff like that, as you may or may not know, it's okay if you don't remember, but I'm a fiction writer, so
That's right.
I definitely empathize, and I've experienced much of the same thing. It's hard work. Yeah, I'm not a freelance writer, but as a fiction writer, you have to sell to magazines, and it's much the same in that
Yeah.
regard. So thank you for doing this with me. This was really cool. I'd love to do it again.
Oh yeah, me too.
And just let people know about you're doing a Kickstarter, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, about 10 days ago, I launched a Kickstarter project. Kickstarter is a website where people raise money for their own personal projects. Very often they're like creative kind of projects. I just launched this Kickstarter about 10 days ago. It's got another 30 days to go. It'll end on October 4th, in which time I'm trying to raise a certain amount of money. I've got to raise that particular amount of money, or else I don't get any money. So it's either all or nothing. And this is for an intensive 2-month-long training called the Transom Story Workshop, and it's hosted by Atlantic Media organization, and that'll be happening in Massachusetts. And it's a workshop in the sort of nuances and the techniques behind actual storytelling, telling a story beyond just putting together a few facts for a news report, and in-depth radio production. And so it's my hope that after 2 months in this intensive training, I'll come out with the kind of professional level skills needed to create a podcast series similar to what you're doing yourself, Jim. Um, and so the idea is to then come back to Iraq late this year, hopefully in December, maybe January, um, and train a small group of local Iraqi journalists who would not be able to get these skills otherwise, in most cases, with the skills that I myself have just learned in radio production and storytelling, and then collaboratively with this small group of journalists create a podcast series, and each episode of the series will focus on an ordinary Iraqi's life. But these are life stories that can teach us something about the recent history of Iraq, or the conflicts that have gone on here, how these conflicts started, who are the players in them, and how the kind of tough choices that ordinary people face and how they're just trying to get by in an awful situation. And so that's the idea, and to get this podcast series out in a mainstream media outlet, like the likes of NPR or Al Jazeera English, or any other outlet that would host it. So I'm trying to raise this money for this to do this training so that I can come back to Iraq and give a training of my own, and then create this podcast series about these ordinary Iraqis' lives. You can check out the Kickstarter page, and I'd encourage people to take a look, watch the video, read the description, share it around with their friends and their colleagues, and donate if they can, if they have any means at all to do so. And the name of the project is called UNHEARD, The Voices of Iraq. And Jim, I'll send you a link to that page, and maybe you can put that up with your podcast. And I'd be so grateful if people were able to spread the word and give and support the project.
Yeah. Like I told you before, that's definitely a podcast that I would want to listen to, and much needed, like much of your work. So, like I said before, not many people are Sam Kimball and can do what you do. But anyway, is there? Do you want to give out your Instagram, or I don't know if you have Twitter, your handles?
Yeah, absolutely. People can sort of follow my day-to-day wanderings here via my Instagram account, where I post pictures and videos of things that I'm reporting on for stories, as well as just daily life. And that's my Instagram handle is Sammy the Outlaw. And so that's SammyTheoutlaw. And I'm also on Twitter, where I'm pretty active, at Sam on the Road. So you can find me there and follow me there. And that's where I'm putting out a lot of the things that I've published, as well as things I'm reading, and just my day-to-day observations. So follow me there and check those out, please.
Before we go, can I ask you, because I love languages, how many languages do you speak, and what are they?
I mean, I guess I just speak three, really, which would be English and French and Arabic. But Arabic itself is really like the dialects that people speak in one country are so different from people in a country, 5, 6, 700 miles away, that very often it's actually, in some cases, really difficult for them to understand each other. In some Arabic dialects, they don't understand each other at all. So it's almost like they're separate little mini languages. Mm-hmm. So I speak English, and I speak French, and I speak Arabic, but within Arabic, I speak the standard written language that's on TV and the news. But I also speak Tunisian dialect and Syrian dialect and Yemeni dialect, and I'm sort of learning Iraqi dialect. and I'm also just starting to learn Kurdish now, which is the local language in the part of Iraq that I'm in, Kurdistan. That's what most people speak. Um, yeah, and I know a little bit of Spanish because I lived in New York City, and you got to know a little bit if you're there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I speak a few. I really just know like bits and pieces of different languages, but I like to study them.
Yeah,
Um, it's hard to really say like when you study a lot, it's hard to say okay what languages do you speak. It really depends on what you mean by speak.
yeah, true indeed. Yeah, I
Right.
know what you mean. Yeah, it's like you can throw around a few phrases, but can you have like an in-depth philosophical conversation is a different
Yeah.
subject.
Or can you do it in English?
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly.
um, cool. So yeah, if I don't know if you want to leave people with something, a message or anything.
Yeah, I would say that people in this period, I'd encourage your students and any of your listeners or your followers to think real long and hard about the importance of media, whether that's media covering issues or stories in the United States, in New York City, where you're based, Jim. Or around the world, like in Iraq or other places in the Middle East. I think that the we live in a period now where our president and our political class is doing as best as it can to make people be disoriented and not believe critical reporting, to see it as fake news, that now famous term. But I think that people should do as much as they can to inform themselves via independent media, via freelance or independent reporters, or outlets that are presenting kind of a different, more critical point of view, particularly about things happening in the Middle East, because the Middle East is a place where the United States is deeply involved. It has been for a long time, and where there's tremendous suffering and many long-standing problems that I think people in the United States can help put an end to, simply through being better informed, and not letting their government go mess around in these countries. And so, yeah, I would say support critical media and support independent journalism, and read and learn as much as you can about the Middle East in particular. That would be my parting words of hope.
Yeah, great message. I'm totally behind that. Part of the reason why I teach the class on propaganda and journalism. And yeah, it seems like one of those things that becomes more relevant as time goes on.
Oh yeah, particularly in this period. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot, man. Take care of yourself. All right.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on, and it was my pleasure. And you take care too.
All right, man. Next time on the Jim Nog Pod, I still don't know who the guest will be for the next podcast episode, but it will be somebody great. I could mention some names, but I won't. Rebecca Perez, Dom Gaffney, Seco 1844, many people, possibly. 3-person podcasts. And please don't forget to support Sam Kimball's Kickstarter, UNHEARD, The Voices of Iraq. A very important project to spread the word of some people who really need their voices heard. Music for Jim Nog Pod by Marco Sanlaguagua, marcosanlaguagua.com. Guagua is spelled Guagua. Art by Seco1844 at Seco1844 on Instagram. Seco is SEKO. My website, which contains news and updates, bios, social media links, contact info, a bibliography, a blog, and a podcast page, is jamesnoguera.com. Noguera is Noguera. Please show your support by subscribing and interacting with the pod on iTunes or whatever your favorite podcatcher happens to be, and on YouTube. You can donate on patreon.com/Jimnog or directly via paypal.me/Jimnog. And thank you for your interest.